Hello, my name is Brian Grubbs. Today we're going to be talking about the English longbow. I'll talk about the materials used in its manufacture, the basic characteristics, a little bit about the men that shot it in history, and then I'll move on to the exploits of the most famous longbow archer of literary history, and that would be Robin Hood. We'll talk about some of the feats of archery that he performed in the books, and whether or not those are actually possible with a real English longbow. Now, the defining characteristic of the longbow is, of course, the length. They averaged anywhere from 6 to 6.5 feet in length. To give you an idea of size comparison, this is a 6-foot longbow, and I am 5'10". So, most of your longbows were at least this tall, if not a little bit taller. The reason for the length of that longbow was the way the bow was manufactured in its cross-section. Most of your modern bows, this one included, have a very flat, rectangular cross-section. I don't know if you can tell this, but you can see it's very narrow in depth and very wide, like this. Now, the English longbow was much narrower in the width and much thicker in the depth, and instead of that rectangular cross-section, it had a D-shaped cross-section. Now, what that did was it enabled you to get more bows out of every tree that you cut down, because if you're using a D-shaped cross-section, you're using less of that exterior wood, which is how the bows were cut. They were cut from the exterior in. You're using less of that per bow, so you can get more D-shaped bows out of a given piece of yew than you could flat-limbed bows, such as this. Now, because of that D-shaped cross-section, the belly of the bow, part of the bow that's towards you, is under a significantly higher amount of compression. Because of that, you had to make the bow longer, or else it would break. So that is the main reason for the length of the longbow. Also, the draw length of the English longbow was a little bit longer than your standard one. When I draw this bow, you'll notice I draw it to the corner of my mouth. That's so when I pull the bow back, I'm looking directly down the arrow as I sight it. The English longbowmen, when they pulled it back, and I'm not going to do that with this bow because it will break, they pulled back to the corner of their jaw, right there at the base of their ear. So, longer draw, the longer your draw is, the longer your bow needs to be. D-shaped cross-section dictates a longer bow, which is why you have the 6 to 6.5 foot bows. Some bows were even longer, up to 7 to 7.5 feet, for an exceptionally tall person. Now, these bows were made out of yew, primarily. Other woods were used, but they were vastly inferior. The reason for that being that yew is a naturally occurring laminated fiber. The exterior sapwood of a yew tree is remarkably strong under tension, like you get on the back of the bow, whereas the heartwood, the inner wood of the tree, is remarkably strong in compression, such as the belly of the bow. So many modern bows are made with a composite material, so that you have one that's excellent in tension and one that's excellent in compression. But yew is that way naturally. You don't have to do anything to it, which is why the English used it. And which was why, towards the end of the 15th century, the yew tree was practically extinct in England, and you couldn't find one, and they had every merchant that came into England was required to bring in yew staves along with their other goods. Now, given the D-shaped cross-section we've already talked about the length, another major difference is here in the handle. You notice I have a cutout here. It's called an Aeroshell, and what that does is it brings the flight of the arrow closer to the center of the bow. Now, because of the way English longbows were made, they actually bent. It's called bending in the handle. If you look at the bend of this bow, when I pull it back, there's no bend in that middle section. All the bend is towards the tips. Now, since the English longbow bends in the middle where the handle is, if you took and made a cutout of it, the bow would break. Now, moving on to arrows. Obviously, their arrows would have been longer because of the way they drew. This is a 28-inch arrow. They used, the average arrow used by an English longbowman was 30 inches, and you also had a 32 to 34-inch flight arrow, which was used, and you draw it back even further, and that was used to deceive your enemies into thinking that they were in range. You know, your flight arrows weren't accurate, they weren't terribly effective, but they could go significantly further. So you're hitting your enemies and they think you're in range, so they start shooting arrows, not realizing that you're not actually in range yet, and so they waste all their arrows. So, kind of a neat trick. The wood that we use commonly today for arrows is cedar. It's very light, it's very springy. They did not use cedar, it's too light. They used birch, several other hard, stiff woods. The main reason for that was the draw weight of the English longbow. This is a 50-pound draw weight bow. It's fairly average by modern standards. Average by medieval standards was anywhere from 110 to 130 pounds. Now, when you shoot an arrow, the arrow flexes. It's called the archer's paradox. You've got so much force coming back so quickly from the base of the arrow that it's going to flex as it fires. What's referred to as the arrow's spine is its ability to resist that flex and spring back. This arrow is spined for a 50-pound bow. When I fire it, it springs just enough and then goes back straight, so the arrow flies straight. If this is too stiff, when it's fired, if you look from here, when it's fired, if it's too stiff, it has a tendency to fly off to the left because it won't curve around. If it's not stiff enough, it's going to shoot to the right. Now, if I tried to fire this out of an English bow with a 150-pound draw weight, the arrow would break and it would stick into my arm and it would hurt quite a bit. So I obviously couldn't use the same types of wood. If you took a cedar arrow and tried to make it thick enough to fire out of a 150-pound bow, it would be so thick that it wouldn't be practical and it wouldn't fly very well, which is why they used the heavier woods. The bowstrings for the medieval longbows were typically made out of hemp. They also used flax and sometimes silk later on once they started trade with the East, but hemp was the most common material, and it was always waxed, as was the bow, to protect it from moisture. If you get moisture into the wood of a bow or into the bowstring, you ruin the effectiveness of that tool until you can dry it out. Now, one of the byproducts of the incredible strength of these bows was it actually changed the physiology of the archers. They've exhumed skeletons of English longbowmen, men who started very young age all the way through their adult lives pulling these powerful, powerful bows. And you can actually tell the skeletal structure is warped and changed. They commonly had bone spurs on their left wrists and shoulders and their right wrists and fingertips from constantly pulling that heavy, heavy bow. Your typical English archer started normally around 5 or 6 with a very small bow, and by the time they were a teenager they were using a full-size war bow. Later on, in the 13 and 1400s, the English monarchs actually mandated that every adult male that could pull a bow had to practice at least once a week, and they even set a fixed distance that they had to practice from. Now, as far as the capabilities of the bow, this bow was very much able to kill anything out there as far as game animals, and with the proper tips you could penetrate most armor at close range. Your effective range in combat was in between 200 and 300 yards, depending on the armor your opponents wore. You had 2 different types of tips. One which is fairly your basic broadhead, such as this, and then your other tip resembles our modern field point. It's called a bodkin tip. It's a long, sharp, needle-type point. It's made for penetrating through chainmail as well as plate armor. Your average rate of fire for an English longbowman was anywhere from 12 to 15 arrows per minute. That's your maximum rate of fire. Normally they didn't fire at that rate because you would run out of arrows too quickly. You would only fire at that rate once your enemy was very close to you. At your longer distances you might fire 4 to 5 arrows a minute. And most of the time you would fire in volleys as an entire group to increase the effectiveness of your shots. Now, there's 3 shots that are talked about in your Robin Hood novels that I want to talk about as far as possibility. The first is shooting at the willow wand. The willow wand was a 2-inch wide stick. They would cut it out of the forest, they would stick it up, and they would shoot at it from various distances, anywhere up to about 50 yards. Now this sounds pretty incredible, but it was very doable with a traditional bow. Quite a few people have done that in modern times. I've done it. I can't do it consistently, but I have done it. But a proficient longbowman can actually hit significantly smaller targets at longer ranges. There's actually some guys that I've seen that can actually shoot an aspirin out of the air with a longbow. So willow wand, very doable. Other things it talks about is the incredible rate of fire which he could fire. If the average English longbowman, if I can shoot 12 arrows a minute, and I'm not that good. I don't practice that much. If that's what I'm capable of, yes, with somebody with that much practice, would be much better at it. The last shot I want to talk about is the mile-long shot. That's impossible. The maximum any bow is recorded at, just a standard combat bow, is around 800 yards. The English longbow's maximum range was about 400 yards, which is far, far short of a mile. So, while that sounds really good, it can't actually happen. So, I appreciate y'all watching this, and I hope you enjoyed it and you possibly learned something. And get out there, get a bow, enjoy some archery, and I'll see y'all on the next video.